It was a typical Wednesday evening at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, one of the busiest in the world. But for one unsuspecting traveler, this night would become a memory that would haunt them for the rest of their life. Tyler, a young man in his late 20s, was on a late-night flight back home from a business trip. After a tiring day, all he wanted was to make his way to the gate, find a quiet seat, and zone out before the flight. As he passed the duty-free shops and restaurants, the hum of announcements echoed to the terminal, blending with the murmur of tired travelers. He found an empty chair near his gate and settled in, grateful for the brief moment of solitude. But as he sat there, waiting for the boarding call, something felt off. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a sensation of being watched. He dismissed it, attributing it to his own exhaustion. But then it happened. He caught sight of a woman walking to the terminal, just a few yards away from him. She was wearing a black coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and her face was hidden in the shadows beneath the hood of her jacket. Tyler thought nothing of it first, but something about the way she moved unsettled him. She didn't seem to be in any rush. She didn't appear to be looking for her gate. Instead, she was moving slowly, almost deliberately, as if she were searching for something or someone. Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He turned back to his phone, but then the woman's figure caught his eye again. This time, she was standing right next to the window, staring out at the runway. He couldn't help but wonder why she was there. No one else was around her. After a few moments, Tyler decided to make his way to the bathroom, hoping to shake off the eerie sensation that had begun to creep up his spine. As he walked past the area where the woman had been standing, he looked over to where she had been just moments before. She was gone. Confused, Tyler paused and scanned the area. He saw no sign of her. He checked his watch. Boarding had already started. Shaking his head, he shrugged it off and headed toward the gate, pushing the unsettling encounter out of his mind. When he reached the gate, a strange sight greeted him. The gate agent was standing next to the desk, holding a clipboard and speaking with another employee in hushed tones. Tyler took his place in line, and as he waited, his eyes instinctively flicked toward the seating area near the gate. That's when he saw her again, the woman in the black coat. She was sitting quietly, waiting for her flight, just like everyone else. Tyler's stomach sank. How was that possible? He had just seen her moments ago by the window. The same black coat, the same eerie, hollow gaze. Unsure what was happening, Tyler approached the gate agent, trying to shake off the sense of dread creeping up his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I just saw someone near the window." She looked different, like she wasn't supposed to be there. The gate agent smiled politely. "There's no one else here, sir. You're the last passenger for the flight." Confused, Tyler stepped back, glancing again at the woman. She was still there, motionless, staring blankly ahead. Something about her didn't seem right. It was like she was waiting. As he got on the plane, Tyler couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. When the plane took off and the cabin lights dimmed, he leaned back into his seat, trying to clear his mind. But then, just as the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Tyler heard something that sent chills running down his spine, a whisper coming from the seat next to him. Turning, he found himself face to face with the woman in the black coat. Her eyes were hollow, unblinking, as if staring straight through him. "You shouldn't have come," she said in a voice that was cold, empty, and distant. Before Tyler could even react, the lights flickered, the plane lurched, and the woman vanished into thin air. It was a quiet evening at Heathrow Airport in London. A handful of passengers milled around the nearly deserted terminal, waiting for the last flights of the night. Claire, a young woman traveling alone, was among them, her flight delayed by a few hours due to a storm that had rolled in. She was exhausted and irritated by the long wait, but decided to make the best of it by finding a quiet corner and reading a book. Her gate was located in a section of the airport that was usually closed off after hours, but since the delay, it was temporarily reopened for the remaining passengers. After a while, Claire felt a sudden need to stretch her legs. She stood up, deciding to walk around the terminal. As she passed by the security doors, she noticed something strange. The door that usually led to a restricted section of the airport was now open. Curious, she walked closer, peeking inside. The lights were dim, casting long shadows along the corridor. The hallway beyond was empty, but there was something eerie about the silence. Claire stepped forward, her footsteps echoing as she walked deeper into the terminal's labyrinth of hallways. The air grew colder, and Claire's heart began to pound in her chest. The further she walked, the more isolated she felt. She checked her watch. It was already 2:30 a.m., and she hadn't seen another person in what seemed like forever. As she reached the end of the corridor, she noticed a door at the far end of the hallway. It was cracked open, just slightly, enough to draw her attention. She walked toward it, hesitant but unable to resist the pull. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. It looked like a storage area, filled with old equipment and boxes. She was about to turn back when she heard a soft whisper, no more than a murmur. She froze. "Help me." Claire's blood ran cold. The voice was faint but unmistakable. She stepped into the room, heart racing, and looked around. The whispering continued, coming from behind one of the boxes. Claire approached cautiously, not knowing if her mind was playing tricks on her or if someone was truly in trouble. But as she reached for the box, the door behind her slammed shut, plunging the room into complete darkness. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for her phone to turn on the flashlight. Her hand trembled as a small beam of light cut through the darkness. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She tried the door, but it was locked. Panic set in. She could hear her own pulse roaring in her ears, drowning out everything else in the room. The whisper came again, softer now, but clearer. It sounded almost like it was coming from behind her, but when Claire spun around, there was no one there. She felt the cold metal of the walls against her back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She stepped forward, determined to find the source of the voice. But the instant she moved toward the boxes, a loud bang echoed from behind her. She whipped around, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the room in a frantic arc. The box nearest to her was now shaking, as though something was trapped inside. "Help me, please." The voice grew louder, more desperate. Claire hesitated for a split second before rushing toward the box. Her hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries to get a grip on the cardboard edges. Finally, with a violent tug, she opened the box. Inside, there was nothing but a stack of old magazines and papers. Nothing moved. The whispering stopped. Confused and shaken, Claire stepped back, breathing heavily. Something wasn't right. The room felt like it was closing in on her. The air was thick with a stifling chill. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of dread in the air was almost palpable. Suddenly, the light flickered. Claire's eyes widened as the shadows in the room seemed to twist, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The temperature dropped further. Claire's breath formed a visible mist in the air. And then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, his face gaunt and pale, wearing a tattered uniform. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, and locked on her. His movements were jerky, as though he was struggling to control his body. Claire's body went rigid with fear. The man began to speak, but his voice was a guttural rasp, incomprehensible at first. Then clearer. "You shouldn't be here." Her chest tightened, the world narrowing as her instinct screamed at her to run. But the man's eyes seemed to hold her in place, and her legs refused to move. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the dark weight of his stare pushing down on her. "Help me!" The man rasped again, his voice becoming more distorted. His lips curled into a twisted smile. "Help me escape." Without warning, the man lunged toward her, his arms outstretched, but Claire didn't hesitate. Adrenaline shot through her like lightning, and she sprinted toward the door. She slammed into it, her shoulder hitting the cold metal with a painful thud, but it didn't budge. She tried the handle again, still locked. Claire's breath was coming in ragged gasps as she backed away from the door. The figure was getting closer, shuffling toward her with an unnatural speed. She felt the darkness closing in, the oppressive air growing heavier, suffocating her. And then, as if by some miracle, the door swung open. Claire didn't hesitate. She bolted into the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls. Behind her, the man's voice rang out, a high-pitched scream that rattled her bones. She didn't look back. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could hear in her ears, drowning out everything else. She ran, her feet pounding against the cold floors, until she finally stumbled back into the main terminal. The lights flickered back on, and the airport seemed to return to its quiet, mundane state. But Claire knew she would never forget the chilling encounter she'd just survived. The door behind her slammed shut, and the eerie whispers vanished into the air as if they had never been there at all. In the early hours of the morning, when the airport was mostly empty, a strange encounter took place at Denver International Airport, a place already known for its mysterious reputation. Sarah, a night shift employee at the airport, was on her way to clock out. She had been working for hours, and it was nearly time to go home. As she walked through the nearly deserted terminal, she passed by the departure gate for a flight heading to Los Angeles. The waiting area was almost completely empty, save for one man who stood alone near the counter, looking lost in thought. He wore the uniform of a pilot. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. Sarah gave him a brief glance and nodded as she passed, but something about him felt off. There was an unnerving stillness in the air around him, like he wasn't really there. She dismissed the thought and continued walking. But then she heard something. The man's voice, low and shaky, whispered her name. Sarah froze, her heart leaping in her chest. She turned around, only to see him staring directly at her, his eyes wide and unblinking. "I'm not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The word sent a chill through Sarah. She approached him cautiously. "Are you okay, sir?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't respond at first, his gaze distant, unfocused. Then, as if snapping out of a trance, he looked at her and said, "I was supposed to leave hours ago. I've been waiting for the call, but it's not coming. I don't know where I am anymore." Confused, Sarah glanced at the departure board. The flight was long gone. She knew it had already boarded and left, but the pilot was still standing there, staring at her, as if waiting for something that would never come. She tried to reassure him. "You need to go to the staff lounge. Maybe you need some rest." He looked at her, his expression falling. "I can't go back there. I've been waiting for a while. For the call." His words didn't make sense. Sarah's unease grew, but then in a blink, the man vanished. One moment he was there, standing at the counter, and the next, nothing. Sarah rushed over to the gate, searching the area, but he was gone. There were no signs of him anywhere. The gate was locked, and no flight had been scheduled for hours. The whole area was eerily quiet. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the encounter in her mind, but no matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't make sense of it. Had she imagined it, or had she encountered something far stranger? It wasn't until the following week that she learned the truth. There had been an incident. The flight the pilot had been waiting for had crashed several years ago. He had never left that gate. It was a stormy night at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and the weather was so severe that flights were delayed or canceled. The airport was packed with frustrated passengers, each looking for a way to pass the time. Among them was Mark, a seasoned traveler who had seen his fair share of chaos at the airport. He had been waiting for his flight for over 3 hours when he finally heard the announcement. His flight was now boarding. Relieved, he grabbed his bag and made his way to the gate. However, as he walked toward the gate, an unsettling feeling washed over him. Something about the terminal felt different tonight. And as he walked through the passageway toward the baggage claim, the hum of voices seemed distant and muffled. It felt as if he was stepping into a space where time itself didn't quite operate as expected. He reached the baggage claim area, where the overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long, eerie shadows across the polished floors. Most of the passengers were distracted by their phones or talking amongst themselves. But there, at the far end of the baggage carousel, something caught his eye. A suitcase, sitting on the conveyor belt, appeared to be moving, but it wasn't moving in the way you would expect. It was rolling along, its wheels turning slowly, as though pushed by invisible hands. Mark's gaze locked onto the suitcase as it jerked forward again, stopping just as suddenly as it had started. He hesitated, unsure whether he was seeing things. But before he could take another step, he heard a soft laugh, a quick, almost unnoticeable sound coming from behind the baggage claim desk. Mark turned his head sharply, scanning the area. No one was there. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of laughter you'd expect from a mischievous child, but something darker, colder. He walked closer to the carousel, his curiosity growing. The suitcase moved again, rolling toward him, almost as though it was beckoning him to come closer. But Mark's gut instinct screamed for him to run in the opposite direction. He turned to leave the area, but as he did, the air seemed to grow colder, more suffocating. "Don't go," a voice whispered, and this time it was clear. It was coming from behind the wall of bags. Mark froze. He turned around, and the suitcase was no longer moving. It lay still, exactly where it had been. But that voice haunted him. It wasn't just the eerie echo of his imagination. It was a voice that had substance, something that had been there long before Mark even stepped foot into baggage claim area. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. Maybe it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. He glanced at the attendants at the front desk, but they were all busy with paperwork, not paying him any attention. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the shadows at the far end of the room. It was a woman, dressed in a weathered trench coat, her face obscured by the hood of her jacket. Mark couldn't see her features clearly, but there was something unsettling about the way she moved, almost gliding, as though she wasn't entirely bound by the physical laws of the world. Without thinking, Mark approached the figure. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. But as soon as he did, she turned and walked briskly toward the rear exit, vanishing through the door. Mark's curiosity got the better of him, and he followed her, pushing open the door to find himself in a dark hallway. The lights were dim, and the faint hum of the airport seemed to fade away entirely. The woman was nowhere in sight. He was about to turn around when he heard a loud clatter behind him. His heart skipped a beat as he spun around. The suitcase, the same suitcase that had been moving earlier, now it was sitting right in front of him, its zipper wide open, but there was no luggage inside, just an empty void. And then the voice came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have followed me," it whispered, chilling his bones. Mark backed away in terror, his breathing quickening. He couldn't comprehend what he was seeing, what was happening. His only instinct was to flee, to escape this nightmare. But as he turned to run, the woman reappeared in front of him, her face now visible. She was pale, gaunt, her eyes wide and empty, her lips stretched into a twisted, unnatural smile. She wasn't human, not anymore. Before Mark could react, she spoke, her voice distorted, echoing in the stillness of the hallway. "You can't leave. Not yet." And just like that, everything went black. It was the end of another exhausting shift at New York's JFK Airport. Samuel, an overnight janitor, was sweeping the floor in one of the quieter terminal sections when he noticed something strange in the far corner of the room. It was a mirror positioned against the wall. But it wasn't like any mirror he had ever seen. It wasn't particularly large, only a few feet tall and wide, with a simple black frame. But the odd thing about it was that it seemed out of place. All of the other mirrors in the airport were standard, functional, meant for travelers to check their appearances. But this one, it felt different. As Samuel approached the mirror, he felt an inexplicable sense of unease wash over him. There was something in the reflection that wasn't quite right. The mirror reflected the airport's empty hallway just as he saw in front of him. But there was a distortion, a shadow in the corner of the glass, far off in the distance. Suddenly, the reflection of the hallway seemed to shift. It became darker, the walls and floor transforming into something far more ominous. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of the reflective surface. Samuel froze, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. As he watched, the reflection of the hallway began to take on a life of its own. The shadows now moved, twisting and coiling like something alive. The space in the mirror seemed to pulse, as though it were a gateway to another world, one far darker and more sinister than the airport. His pulse quickened as he backed away from a mirror. But then, something made him stop. A figure emerged from the reflection. It was a man dressed in a pilot's uniform. His face was obscured by a mask of shadows, his eyes empty. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the glass. "Don't look away," the figure whispered, his voice low and gravely, as if it came from deep within the mirror itself. "Once you see, you can't unsee." Samuel's hand shook as he reached for his phone, the screen flickering as if reacting to the strange energy coming from a mirror. He tried to call out for help, but his voice caught in his throat. The air around him thickened, growing suffocating. With an effort, he forced his gaze away from the mirror, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The reflection seemed to mock him, as though it knew he was no longer looking. The shadowy figure in the mirror slowly reached out toward him, its fingers just inches from the surface. But when Samuel turned back to face the mirror one last time, there was nothing there. The hallway was as it should be, empty, quiet. The strange figure had vanished, but the sense of dread lingered. Samuel didn't stay much longer in that terminal. In fact, he made sure never to come back to that section of the airport again. He didn't speak of the experience to anyone, but he knew deep down that something had been watching him from beyond that mirror, a thing that existed in the reflection, waiting. And perhaps, just perhaps, it still waits. Somewhere in the vast, quiet halls of an airport, ready to claim its next witness. It was supposed to be a routine shift for Marcus, the night security guard at LAX, a job he had grown accustomed to over the past 5 years. He'd seen his fair share of strange occurrences, but the eerie and unnerving things he'd witnessed over the years didn't prepare him for the events that unfolded one fateful night. It was just after midnight when Marcus noticed something odd as he made his rounds. The terminal was unusually quiet. There were only a few late-night flights left, and most of the passengers had already boarded. He passed by the gate where a flight to London was scheduled, noticing the large flight attendant's counter near the gate was completely empty. But, he thought, that wasn't strange. The staff had probably just taken a break. What unsettled him was the distinct sound of the flight crew chatter that came from the counter. The voice was low, hushed, but unmistakable. The sound of flight attendants discussing their pre-flight duties. It was so clear, so real, that Marcus assumed there must be a crew present. He approached the counter to check, expecting to see the flight attendants preparing. But as he got closer, his stomach sank. The room was completely deserted. The counter was unmanned. In fact, the entire gate area was empty, save for the scattered chairs. No one was preparing for flight. He checked his watch, 12:15 a.m. The flight to London wasn't due to leave until 2 a.m., so the crew had plenty of time. But why were their voices coming from an empty gate? A cold shiver ran down Marcus' spine, and against his better judgment, he stepped closer to the counter. That's when he heard again, a faint, ghostly giggle, followed by the soft click of heels against the tile floor. It was the unmistakable sound of flight attendants walking, just beyond the counter, toward the back of the terminal. He paused, wondering if it was just his imagination, but the sound grew louder, sharper. "Hello," Marcus called out into the empty terminal. The sound of clicking heels stopped immediately. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Something was terribly wrong. His instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave, but he forced himself to stay. His flashlight flickered as he walked toward the area where the sound had come from. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman dressed in a flight attendant's uniform, her appearance impeccable. But there was something wrong about her. Her eyes were hollow, her skin unnaturally pale, almost like a corpse. The woman gave him a quick, polite smile as she adjusted her uniform, but Marcus could see the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but chilling. Marcus' throat went dry. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. I thought I heard voices. Are you prepping for flight?" The woman nodded, still smiling, but there was a strange flicker in her eyes, a look of confusion that made Marcus uneasy. "We're ready, just waiting for the captain." Suddenly, a man appeared behind her. He wore a pilot's uniform, but his face was unsettling. It looked like someone had carved it into an unnatural shape, the features sharp and rigid. The pilot's smile mirrored the attendant's, and for a moment, the two of them stare at Marcus, their hollow gazes fixed on him. "The flight's almost ready, sir," the pilot said in a low, rasping voice. "You should come with us. The others are waiting." Marcus' heart thudded painfully in his chest. The words "the others" echoed in his mind, and it was as if the room around him began to shift, growing darker, colder. The sense of unease he felt grew to a boiling point. "I think I need to go," Marcus muttered, instinctively backing away. "I'll check on the others at gate 22. Before he could turn around, the flight attendant reached out and grabbed his wrist, her grip unnervingly strong. Her touch felt cold as ice, sending a shock of dread through his body. "No! You're not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice suddenly distorted and unnatural like a low growl. "You're staying with us forever." Panic surged through Marcus. He tried to pull away, but the flight attendant's grip was like iron. The pilot stepped forward, his twisted smile widening. In a burst of desperate strength, Marcus yanked his arm free, stumbling backward. He ran as fast as he could, the sound of the flight crew's footsteps echoing behind him. He didn't dare look back. When Marcus finally reached the security office, breathless and shaken, he slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. His hands trembled as he dialed for backup, but when the call connected, all he heard was static. He didn't speak of the event that night to anyone. No one at the airport believed him when he mentioned what he saw. But the oddest part of the whole incident? When Marcus checked the flight logs the next morning, he found that no such crew was listed for the London-bound flight. In fact, the flight wasn't even scheduled to depart that night. The crew he had encountered didn't exist in any record, and the terminal had been completely empty by the time he ran out of the gates. Was it a hallucination? An eerie, otherworldly encounter with the dead? Marcus wasn't sure, but he would never forget the cold touch of those flight attendants and the sinister grin of the captain. Part 7, The Silent Passengers. There's a quiet corner of Miami International Airport that few travelers know about. It's tucked away, past the food court, near the employee hallways, a place that most passengers will never find. But it was in this forgotten space that Emily, a late-night janitor, would experience something so strange that it would change her life forever. It had been a long night. Emily had been assigned to clean the final gate area after all the flights had boarded, a duty usually reserved for those who were new to the airport. As she cleaned the terminal, she couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet the space had become. The lights flickered above her, and the hum of the usual bustling airport seemed to be missing. As she swept the floors, Emily began to hear faint whispers. At first, she thought it was the noise of the air conditioning system, but as she moved close to gate 47, the whispers grew louder, clearer, like passengers conversing in hushed tones. But when Emily glanced over to the gate, no one was there. It was empty. All the seats were vacant, and the flight to New York had already boarded over an hour ago. She dismissed it as her imagination getting the better of her, continuing her work. However, as she neared the windows by the gate, she saw something in the reflection. A group of people sitting in the chairs, their faces blurry and indistinct. They were silent, staring ahead. Emily froze. The passengers were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the kind you might see in photos from the 1950s or 60s. Their faces were pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow as if they hadn't blinked in ages. They sat perfectly still, their bodies stiff and unmoving. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, one of the figures shifted. It was a woman sitting in the front row. She turned her head toward Emily, her eyes locking with hers. A cold chill filled the room. Emily quickly stepped back, looking around the empty gate, but when she turned back toward the reflection, the passengers were gone. The gate was now completely empty again. Emily's mind raced. She grabbed her phone and dialed the front desk, asking if there were any flights still scheduled or any passengers left behind. But the voice on the other end assured her that the gate had been closed hours ago and all flights had left. Shaken, she finished her shift in a daze. But even now, every time she walks past that same gate, she can feel the eyes of the silent passengers watching her from the corner of her vision. Late one evening, just before the airport started winding down for the night, a man named David, an experienced traveler, found himself at an airport far from home. He had arrived hours early for his overnight flight, a small, seemingly inconspicuous flight that would take him across the country. It was a typical late-night departure from a smaller terminal, with few travelers lingering around. The airport was quiet and dim, the fluorescent lights casting long, flickering shadows across the sleek tile floors. There was an almost eerie stillness in the air, as though the place had been abandoned. David settled into a seat at one of the gates, hoping to pass the time by reading his book. The terminal was nearly empty, save for a few tired travelers, a couple of staff members, and a few lone security guards doing their rounds. He glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m. He still had an hour before boarding. That's when he noticed a strange group standing near Gate 23, at the far end of the terminal. The group didn't look like the usual late-night travelers. They were all dressed in formal, vintage clothing, as though they had stepped out of a different time entirely. The women wore long, dark coats with high collars, and the men had sharp suits and fedoras. Their faces were pale, almost too pale, and they didn't seem to talk to each other. Instead, they stood motionless, staring ahead into the empty terminal. David watched them for a moment, feeling a sudden, inexplicable unease creep up his spine. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just late-night fatigue playing tricks on him. He turned back to his book, but he couldn't help stealing glances at the group out of the corner of his eye. The minutes passed, and David found his eyelids growing heavy. As he was about to close his eyes and nod off, he heard the unmistakable sound of a gate opening. He glanced up and saw the group walking toward the jetway, moving slowly, their steps synchronized. They didn't seem to speak, nor did they look back at the terminal. They just moved, as if drawn to the plane that was waiting at the gate. Feeling uneasy but also curious, David stood up and walked toward Gate 23, careful to stay out of sight as the mysterious passengers boarded. It was then that he noticed the flight number on the display above the gate. It was a flight he had never seen before. It wasn't listed anywhere in the airport's departure information. He stepped closer to the gate, squinting to read the boarding sign. Flight 883, it read. Destination unknown. David's heart skipped a beat. Unknown, he muttered to himself. That's not possible. All flights have a destination. He stood there frozen, torn between his natural skepticism and the feeling of growing dread building inside him. The strange passengers, their pale faces, and the fact that the flight seemed to have no destination. It was all too bizarre. But before he could act on his suspicions, the door to the plane closed and the jetway retracted. He watched as the plane's engines roared to life, the sound echoing through the empty terminal. For a moment, David felt like he was in a dream, caught between sleep and reality. The plane was moving, yet no one else seemed to acknowledge it. The people at the other gates didn't seem to notice the plane, nor the eerie group of passengers that had boarded. Just as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, David felt an overwhelming urge to act. He grabbed his things, made a split-second decision, and ran down the hallway to the nearest exit door. He had to see where the plane was going. His flight to New York was still hours away, but the strange flight had him intrigued and terrified. He rushed out to the runway area just in time to see the plane lifting off into the sky, a slow, almost deliberate ascent. But what caught his attention was that it didn't take the usual flight path toward the east. It flew straight into the night sky, heading in an unfamiliar direction, one that didn't align with any air routes he was aware of. David stood there, frozen, watching as the aircraft faded into the darkness, its silhouette swallowed by the blackness of the night. His heart hammered in his chest, and his thoughts raced. That was when he noticed something even stranger. The terminal had gone completely silent. The hum of the airport, the low murmur of voices, the sound of luggage wheels on the floors, the distant announcements, was gone. The lights flickered for a moment, and then everything returned to normal. The air felt thick with an eerie stillness, as if the entire place had reset. But when he looked at the departure board again, the flight was gone. Flight 883 wasn't listed. There was no trace of it ever existing. He went back to the terminal and tried to tell the security guards what he had seen, but they dismissed him. When he asked about the mysterious passengers in the strange flight, the guards only shrugged and looked at him as if he were a madman. David's flight to New York boarded without incident. and he was on his way, but his mind refused to let go of what he had witnessed. The strange passengers in vintage clothing, the flight that seemed to have no destination, the eerie sense of something out of place that lingered long after the plane had disappeared into the night. Months passed, but David couldn't stop thinking about that night. He had told no one else about what he had seen, certain that people would think he was insane. Yet, the feeling that something unexplainable had occurred remained. The strangest part? He never saw that flight number again. Flight 883, destination, unknown, had never been recorded in any airport log, any official records. It was as if it had never existed at all. David never traveled that airport again, but the memory of the flight to nowhere continued to haunt him. A question lingered, unanswered. What had he truly seen that night? Was it a glitch in the matrix, an anomaly in the fabric of time, or something far more sinister? After years of working as a baggage handler at Boston Logan International Airport, Emma had seen it all. Lost luggage, forgotten bags, and the occasional strange encounter with travelers. But there was one thing that always gnawed at her. Every time she worked a night shift in the lower baggage hall, she felt something was off. It wasn't just the isolation of the job or the eerie quiet. It was something more. The walls, she swore, were whispering. At first, she thought it was just the hum of the ventilation system or the creaks of the old buildings settling under the weight of thousands of flights. But as the months went by, the whispers began to grow clearer. One night, as she walked past an abandoned corner of the baggage claim, she stopped dead in her tracks. She heard something distinctly, a voice soft and indistinct, as if it were calling her name. Emma? Emma? The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, echoing through the maze of conveyor belts and storage rooms. It was low and urgent, like a whispering plea for help. She shivered, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. No one was supposed to be down there this late. The other workers had finished for the day. The voice continued, repeating her name over and over again. She walked toward the source of sound, her footsteps hesitant, but her curiosity pulling her forward. As she rounded a corner, she saw a dark figure standing in the shadows, just barely visible. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out. There was no response, but the whispering continued. It was like the walls themselves were alive, vibrating with the sound of voices, low and hushed, each carrying a sorrowful tone. Emma felt a cold draft brush past her, and the temperature in the room dropped significantly. The figure in the shadows stepped forward, and Emma's blood ran cold. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, with a pale, drawn face and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. "You shouldn't be here," the woman whispered, her voice distant, almost mournful. "This place is not for the living." Emma wanted to run, but she was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of the woman. Then, without a word, the figure turned and walked into shadows, disappearing as if it had never existed. The whispers continued, growing louder, until they felt like 1,000 voices inside her head. "Get out," they urged. "Leave before it's too late." The next day, Emma requested a transfer. She never spoke of the incident to anyone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the airport was haunted, that something dark had claimed it as its own. Sophia had always found solace in the predictability of her job. As a baggage claim officer at the Denver International Airport, she spent most of her shifts unloading and sorting the endless stream of luggage that passed through. The long hours, the repetitive motions, and the constant hum of the terminal became background noise to her, a monotonous routine that didn't leave much room for anything unexpected. That is, until one rainy night in late September, when everything changed. Sophia had been working the night shift, as usual. The airport was almost deserted, with only a handful of late-night arrivals. It was quiet, save for the softest of the luggage conveyors and the occasional murmur of a lone passenger talking to an attendant. It was around 2:30 a.m. when the strange incident began. Sophia was sorting through the bags on the carousel when she noticed a large, old-fashioned suitcase sitting on the conveyor belt. At first, she thought it had been abandoned by one of the previous passengers, but when she checked the label, there was no name, no destination. Nothing to identify who it belonged to. Curious, she lifted the heavy suitcase off the belt and set it on the ground beside her. She felt an odd chill in the air, though the terminal was warm and the heat still radiated from the overhead lights. The luggage was worn, the leather cracked, and the brass clasps looked like they'd been polished countless times over the years. There was something about it that felt wrong. The weight of it, the heaviness that seemed to grow with each passing second, made her wonder how it had made it through security without being flagged. She tried to open the suitcase, but the latches were stubborn, as if they didn't want to be opened. Sophia applied more pressure, grunting as she struggled with the stubborn case. Finally, with a sharp snap, the clasps gave way and she opened the lid. The smell that hit her was immediate: stale air, musty fabric, and something else, something metallic. But as she looked inside, her stomach dropped. There were no clothes or personal items, no signs of a typical traveler's belongings. Instead, the case was filled with old photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. Some of the photos were black and white, others sepia-toned, but all of them showed the same scene: a family standing together in front of a house that seemed to be decaying in the background. The people in the photos looked eerily similar to one another, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and sad, vacant expressions. Sophia pulled out a few of the photos, her fingers trembling as she flipped through them. The further she dug into the suitcase, the more unsettling the images became. In one photo, the family stood outside the house, but one of them, a woman, was looking directly at the camera, her eyes wide and filled with terror. In another, the entire family stood in a row, but there was a faint shadow behind them, a shadow that appeared to be moving. Suddenly, a chill ran down Sophia's spine. The shadow in the photos was wrong. It wasn't natural. It wasn't cast by any light source. It was as though something was hovering behind them, something that didn't belong in the picture. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she quickly put the photos back in the suitcase, trying to calm herself. But something was wrong. The air around her felt thick, heavy, and it was becoming harder to breathe. She looked around the baggage claim area, but no one else was there. The distant hum of the airport was now completely absent, replaced by a strange, suffocating silence. Before she could close the suitcase, a sound interrupted her, a low whisper that seemed to come from all around her. At first, it was indistinct, just a murmur. But then, as if the words were meant specifically for her, she heard it clearly. "Help us. Please." Sophia's blood ran cold. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her skin crawled, her breath shallow. She slammed the lid of the suitcase shut and pushed it away from her, almost falling backward in the process. The whispering continued, now louder, more insistent. "Help us. Help us." Her hands shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket, dialing the security office. But before she could speak, the call was cut off. The whispering intensified, surrounding her. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. She could feel the weight of the voices pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Without thinking, she grabbed the suitcase and ran for the exit, her legs trembling beneath her. As she passed through the security doors, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass. A figure, standing just behind her, pale and thin, its hollow eyes staring at her through the reflection. She whipped around, but the figure was gone. Sophia didn't stop running until she reached her car. She threw open the door and drove home, the whispering voices still echoing in her mind. But when she returned to the airport the next day, everything seemed normal. The baggage area was buzzing with activity, and no one seemed to notice the strange suitcase that had haunted her. And then, when she checked the records, she discovered something that sent chills down her spine. There was no suitcase on the conveyor belt that night. No trace of it. The entire night shift's logs were wiped clean. The suitcase had never existed in the airport's records. But Sophia knew what she had seen. The photographs, the whispers, the figure in the reflection. She couldn't explain it, but she was certain of one thing. Something had followed her home that night. Ben, a frequent business traveler, was on his way to catch an early morning flight at a small regional airport in Portland, Oregon. He wasn't thrilled about the early hour, but he'd gotten used to the routine of tight connections, jet lag, and airport delays. It was just part of his life now. That morning, The airport felt strangely empty. The check-in counter was abandoned, and there was no sign of the usual crowd of business people. The terminal was eerily quiet, with only a few souls waiting in the lounge. Ben grabbed a coffee from a vending machine and sat down in one of the uncomfortable chairs, glancing at his watch. He still had about 45 minutes before boarding. It wasn't long before a man in a dark overcoat walked into the terminal, carrying a small suitcase. The man appeared to be in his mid-50s, his face obscured by a dark hat. Ben didn't think much of it, but the man's behavior was odd. He kept looking around the terminal, as though he were searching for something or someone. His eyes darted from corner to corner, scanning every empty chair and empty hallway. He seemed disoriented, almost as if he didn't belong there. After a moment, the man noticed Ben sitting nearby and approached him. He stood a few feet away, not speaking, just staring at him with wide, hollow eyes. Ben froze, a strange sense of unease washing over him. "Can I help you?" Ben asked, trying to be polite, but unable to ignore the man's odd behavior. The man didn't respond, only continued to stare. Ben could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. The man's stare seemed to penetrate into his very soul, and for a brief moment, Ben felt like he was trapped in some kind of dream. And then, without a word, the man turned and walked toward the gate. Ben watched him disappear down the hallway, but when he checked the gate area moments later, the man was nowhere to be seen. Confused, Ben shook his head. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe it was the early hour playing tricks on his mind. But as he boarded the plane later that morning, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The seat next to his was occupied by a figure, an empty seat, with an empty coat draped across it. The flight attendants hadn't assigned anyone to that seat, and when Ben asked about it, they looked at him strangely, as if there was no one there at all. When he looked out the window at the runway, he saw a figure standing in the distance, his silhouette barely visible in the morning fog. The man in the overcoat was still there, watching him. Ben's flight was uneventful, but when he landed at his destination, there was no trace of the man. The empty seat remained a mystery, and the figure on the runway seemed to vanish as soon as he took his eyes off it. Ben never saw the man again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom traveler was still out there, somewhere between flights, waiting, watching, and waiting for someone to notice. It was a crisp fall evening when Mark, a young air traffic controller, began his late-night shift at a small, isolated regional airport. The kind of shift that no one ever wanted to work. Quiet, with only a few planes coming in and out. The kind of shift that left you with your own thoughts and the eerie hum of the radar screen as your only company. Mark had been working for several months at the airport, and while it wasn't exactly a prestigious job, it paid the bills. Most of the time, he'd pass his hours by listening to the soft crackle of the radio, communicating with pilots coming and going, but tonight felt different. The terminal was all but deserted, and Mark was alone in the control tower, staring at the empty runway through the massive windows. The lights of the airport gleamed off the wet asphalt below, and everything was strangely still. It wasn't supposed to be this quiet. There should have been more planes coming and going. The terminal should have been alive with the usual sounds of passengers moving between gates, the whirring of luggage trolleys, the distant calls for boarding. But there was nothing, just silence. Mark had learned to ignore the occasional strange feeling of isolation that came with working the graveyard shift, but tonight the stillness felt oppressive. It was as though the very air was holding its breath. His attention shifted to the radar screen. A plane was coming in, but something about it caught his eye. It wasn't on a regular flight plan, nor did it match any of the usual flights arriving at that time. There was no flight number, no indication of where it was coming from. Just a blip on the screen, moving steadily toward the runway. He checked the comms, but there was no contact from the plane, no response to his attempts to reach the pilot. Odd. He tried again, repeating the standard greeting. "This is Control Tower. Please respond. You are approaching the runway. Please confirm your identity and your intentions." Nothing. The blip continued its steady approach, as though it was ignoring him entirely. Mark's heart rate quickened. Maybe the system was malfunctioning, but why wasn't the plane responding? He continued to watch the radar. His fingers hovered over the keys, but he was unsure of what to do next. Without any other option, He decided to follow protocol and alert the ground crew to prepare for an unscheduled landing. He called the maintenance crew and instructed them to be ready for a plane that wasn't supposed to be arriving. But when he turned back to the radar screen, his breath caught in his throat. The plane had vanished. The blip was gone, as though it had never been there. Panicked, Mark checked the radar again, but there was nothing. No plane, no blip, no sign that it had ever existed. He stood up, suddenly feeling claustrophobic in the small, isolated control tower. His palms were sweating. Was he imagining things? Could he have made a mistake? But then, his eyes caught something through the window. At the far end of the runway, a single light flickered. It was too dim to be a plane, too close to the ground to be a car. It was just hovering. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but his confusion only deepened. He had never seen anything like it. The light moved slowly along the tarmac, swaying like a lantern in the breeze. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light vanished into the darkness. Mark's pulse raced. He grabbed the radio once more, trying to contact the ground crew again, but the static on the line was deafening. His frustration grew, but then something strange happened. A voice crackled through the radio, but it wasn't a voice from the airport or a pilot. It was faint, distorted, and had an eerie undertone. "We see you, Mark. You can't hide." The voice was low and cold, like it was coming from a place far deeper than the radio waves. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. He was alone in the tower. The voice, whoever it was, knew his name. He bolted from the chair, his breath catching in his throat. The lights in the tower flickered, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. "Who is this?" he demanded, trying to force his voice to sound calm, but it cracked, betraying his fear. There was a long silence on the radio, and then the voice returned, slower this time, almost as if it were savoring his fear. "You should never have been here, Mark." The voice lingered in his ears, sending chills down his spine. Mark felt the air around him grow colder. The shadows and corners of the control tower seemed to stretch and move, alive with something dark. He tried to leave, but the door to the control tower wouldn't budge. It felt as though something unseen was holding it shut. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. The radio crackled once again. "You are ours now." Suddenly, the flickering light from the runway reappeared, much closer this time. Mark turned his head, his eyes locked onto it, his pulse racing with a mix of terror and disbelief. The light hovered at the base of the tower, just below the window. He could see figures now, shadowy forms that move around the light, their shapes indiscernible in the darkness. But one thing was clear, their eyes were glowing like lanterns in the dark. Mark backed away from the window, his breath shallow, his mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? No. The air was too thick, too oppressive. There was something deeply wrong with this place, with the voices on the radio and the figures watching him from the runway. Suddenly, the lights in the control tower flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. The voice, still on the radio, spoke again, clearer now, as if it were standing right behind him. "We see you always." The whisper echoed in his ears as the tower fell silent. The light still out and the figures in the shadows just outside the window growing closer, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Mark tried to scream, but no sound came. He was trapped. Rachel had been a frequent flyer for years, and she had seen her fair share of strange occurrences at airports, long delays, unexplained cancellations, and the occasional ominous encounter. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened on her flight from Los Angeles to Chicago. It had been a routine flight, or so she thought. The plane was nearly full, passengers settling into their seats, murmuring quietly among themselves as they awaited takeoff. Rachel had already buckled her seatbelt and was reading a book when something unusual caught her attention. The man sitting in the aisle seat next to her was staring out the window, staring so intently that it almost seemed like he was trying to peer into another world. "Everything okay?" Rachel asked, her voice laced with concern. The man didn't respond. His gaze was locked onto the window, his fingers gripping the armrest so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Rachel leaned over to get his attention again, but the man's eyes were wide open, staring through the glass without blinking. And then the plane began to shake. At first, it was a small tremor, barely noticeable. But then it intensified, the turbulence growing fiercer. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the flight attendants hurried down the aisles, securing everything in place. The shaking seemed to last longer than it should have, the plane bouncing in midair as if it were caught in some invisible storm. Rachel's heart raced. She looked at the man next to her, but he didn't flinch. His eyes were still glued to the window. There was a strange energy in the air, an eerie tension that filled the cabin. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the turbulence stopped. The plane was calm again, but the passengers were visibly shaken. Everyone was looking at each other, whispering, exchanging nervous glances. Rachel turned to the man beside her. He was still staring out the window, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide open in shock. "Are you all right?" she asked again, more urgently. The man slowly turned to face her. His lips parted, and he whispered in a voice that sent chills down her spine. "We shouldn't have taken this flight. We're not supposed to be here." Before Rachel could respond, the man's body jerked violently, his arms twitching as if he were struggling against some unseen force. His eyes rolled back in his head, and with one final gasp, he slumped forward, lifeless. Rachel screamed, but the flight attendants arrived too late. The man was gone. The rest of the flight was a blur, chaotic, filled with panic and disorienting. But by the time they landed in Chicago, no one remembered the incident. The man's seat was empty, and when Rachel tried to report what happened, no one believed her. And when she checked her ticket, she found something even more unsettling. The flight number wasn't listed anywhere. It was as though it never existed at all. The only thing she could remember was the strange warning the man had given her. "We're not supposed to be here." It was just before dawn when Emily found herself in a small, almost forgotten corner of a regional airport in New Orleans. She had been traveling for work, a long-haul flight from the West Coast that had left her drained and anxious to get home. Her connection in New Orleans had been delayed, and now, with only a few hours to spare, she was stuck in the mostly deserted terminal. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of humidity only southern cities could conjure. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting an eerie glow on the empty rows of seats. The only sounds were the occasional announcements over the intercom, the shuffle of footsteps in the distance, and the soft hum of vending machines. Emily, too tired to really care about the strange atmosphere, took a seat at one of the gates. The area was largely empty, except for a few passengers scattered throughout. Most were dozing off, some scrolling through their phones, and one or two were chatting quietly. It was the perfect kind of desolate quiet she'd come to expect from airports in the middle of the night. But something about this airport felt different, unsettling. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it was as though the building itself was holding its breath. She sat there for about 15 minutes, mindlessly scrolling through her phone, when she saw it. At least, she thought she saw it. In the row of seats opposite hers, a man was sitting. She hadn't noticed him at first, and there was something about his posture that seemed off. He sat with his back straight, eyes focused on the floor, hands folded neatly in his lap. He wore a dark overcoat despite the warm weather outside, and his face was partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. His features were hard to make out, but the way he sat, rigid, still, was almost unnatural. Emily's gaze lingered on him for a moment, but something about the way he sat made her uneasy. It was as though he didn't belong there, as though he was out of place in the living world entirely. She blinked and looked away, but when she looked back just seconds later, he was gone. Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. The row of chairs was completely empty. There wasn't a trace of the man who had been sitting there just moments ago. She glanced around the terminal, half expecting to see him standing in the distance, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Her skin prickled with a cold sensation, the kind you get when you feel like you're being watched. She shook it off as just her imagination playing tricks. Fatigue, maybe, or the lingering remnants of a long day. Airports could feel weird at night, especially when they were as quiet as this one. But as the minutes dragged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few more minutes passed, and Emily decided to head to the restroom to wash her face and clear her head. The terminal was still quiet, but now the silence seemed heavier, more suffocating. As she walked down the hallway toward the restrooms, she passed a small cafe area that was usually bustling with people during the day. But now, the chairs and tables were empty, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. She paused when she noticed something odd at one of the tables, a large, dark suitcase sitting by itself. There was no one nearby, no one in the vicinity who seemed to claim it. Curiosity nudged her, and despite herself, Emily walked toward the suitcase. It was an old-fashioned thing, beaten up, with a cracked leather exterior and brass clasps that looked worn from years of use. The suitcase was large, far too large to belong to anyone traveling alone. And yet, there it sat, as though it had just appeared out of nowhere. She bent down to inspect it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the clasp. It was then that she noticed something strange, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from inside the suitcase. A soft scratching sound like something or someone was moving around inside. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood back quickly, eyes wide. The sound continued, growing louder, as though whatever was inside the suitcase was now trying to escape. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do. Should she open it? Should she call someone? Before she could decide, a voice broke the stillness, coming from behind her. "Don't open it." Emily whipped around, startled, her pulse racing. Standing there, just behind her, was the man from earlier, the one who had been sitting across the terminal. He was still wearing the same dark overcoat, the same wide-brimmed hat, his face still partially obscured by shadow. Her breath hitched in her throat. Who are you?" The man didn't respond, his eyes never leaving the suitcase. He seemed to be waiting, watching her, his expression unreadable. "Don't open it," he repeated, his voice low and steady. "It's not meant to be opened." Emily's gaze shifted back to the suitcase. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She didn't know what to do. She wasn't sure she wanted to know what was inside, but the man's warning only added to her unease. What kind of suitcase made a sound like that? Her mind raced. Should she call security? Tell someone? But the man wasn't moving, standing still and unwavering, watching her every move. His presence was suffocating. For a long moment, Emily considered turning and walking away. But then, without warning, the suitcase let out a soft pop, like the sound of a lock being undone. The man's eyes flashed, panic flickering in his gaze. He stepped forward quickly, his voice urgent. "I told you not to open it," he hissed. But it was too late. The suitcase's top popped open on its own, the brass latches clicking loudly in the stillness. The interior of the suitcase was empty, except for a small, crumpled note lying on the bottom. Emily bent down to pick it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The note was handwritten, the ink smeared as if written in a hurry. The message read, "If you open it, you'll never leave." Before Emily could process the note, a loud crash came from behind her. She spun around just in time to see the terminal doors swinging open, a gust of cold wind blowing in from outside. A tall, shadowy figure stood in the doorway. It was barely visible, just a silhouette against the pale light of the early morning. But Emily could feel its presence, feel its eyes boring into her. The man who had warned her stepped back, his face pale with terror. "Run," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Run while you still can." Emily didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she ran, she heard something behind her, a soft shuffle, the sound of footsteps following too closely, too fast. She didn't dare look back. The terminal seemed to stretch on forever, the doors ahead moving farther away with each desperate step she took. When she finally burst through the exit doors and into the open air, the wind almost knocked her off her feet. But when she turned to look behind her, the airport was gone. The terminal, the dark figure, the strange suitcase, they had all vanished into the night. Only the empty road stretched before her, silent and still. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting pale light over the quiet road in front of Emily, She couldn't shake the feeling that the strange, unsettling events weren't over. She had escaped the airport. At least, that's what she told herself. But something was different. Something was following her, waiting for her to realize it. And she knew, deep in her gut, that it wasn't over. Wherever she went next, whatever city, whatever airport, she would always remember the warning. If you open it, you will never leave. And she couldn't help but wonder, had she really escaped? Or had the darkness already followed her home? Emily didn't know what happened, but she began noticing the subtle signs that her life was no longer the same. After her harrowing encounter at the New Orleans airport, everything had seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. She managed to catch a flight home, a direct one this time, her mind a swirl of unanswered questions. Her once peaceful world felt shattered, but the nightmares had been worse. Each time she closed her eyes, the faceless figure, the suitcase, and the eerie warning plagued her. She tried to bury the memory, telling herself it was a hallucination, a side effect of fatigue, stress, or perhaps even a fever dream. But no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she felt the pull of that dark presence, a feeling that followed her wherever she went. It lingered like a shadow in her peripheral vision. Now, weeks later, Emily was back in her apartment, trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But the unease she had been carrying around had intensified. The reflections in mirrors had started to change. At first, it was just a flicker, a second-long distortion in the glass, a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. She thought it was just her imagination, but it kept happening. The mirror over her bathroom sink, the hallway mirror near the door. The reflection started to show things she wasn't doing, movements that weren't hers. It was on one such occasion, late one evening, when Emily was brushing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror that she saw it. She thought she'd imagined a quick motion in her peripheral vision, but when she focused on her reflection, her heart sank. Her reflection wasn't the same as her actions. As she ran the brush through her hair, the figure in the mirror paused for just a moment. It stared back at her with an expression she had never seen before. Its eyes were wide, too wide, as if trapped in a silent scream. Its mouth moved, but no sound escaped. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Her breath quickened, and she spun around, her gaze darting to the empty bathroom. There was nothing there. Confused, she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was normal again, calm, no longer distorting. She looked at herself, blinking rapidly, trying to rationalize what she had just seen. It was only a moment, only a flicker, but the memory of those eyes haunted her. "Stop it, Emily," she whispered to herself, backing away from the mirror. "You're just tired. You're imagining things." But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The mirrors had never been her friend, and now they seemed to be toying with her. Emily couldn't ignore the nagging feeling any longer. The moment she stepped foot back on an airplane, this time for a business trip to Chicago, the sense of dread she had been trying to push down rushed back with full force. She couldn't quite explain why, but something about the flight, about being closed in a plane with hundreds of strangers, felt like the most dangerous place she could be. It wasn't just the claustrophobia or the turbulence that bothered her. It was the sense that something was lurking in the air, something waiting. The flight was uneventful at first. Emily sank into her seat, trying to distract herself with a book, but the weight of the past few weeks pressed down on her. She hadn't told anyone what had happened. No one would believe her, so she kept it to herself, in the quiet corners of her mind. But she was starting to feel like she was losing control. As the plane cruised steadily through the night sky, a strange unease settled over her. She couldn't help but look around at the other passengers. Their faces were oddly distant, as if they weren't fully present in this world. She tried to shake it off, closing her eyes for a moment, but when she opened them again, something was different. The woman sitting across the aisle from her was staring directly at her. At least, she thought it was the same woman. The stranger had been minding her own business earlier, reading a book, but now she was watching Emily intently. Her gaze was unnerving, cold and empty, as though she could see straight through Emily. Emily glanced away, unsure she was imagining things. But when she looked back, the woman was still staring, her eyes piercing, unblinking. And then, as if reading her thoughts, the woman spoke in a whisper, low enough so only Emily could hear. "You shouldn't have gotten on this flight." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. The woman's face remained expressionless, her lips barely moving, as if she was delivering a warning meant for Emily alone. The moment stretched into eternity, and then, as if the tension had broken, the woman went back to her book, as if nothing had happened. Emily couldn't help but feel like she was in some kind of nightmare, one that she couldn't wake up from. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Emily wasn't sure, but the unease in her chest only grew. Then came the first sign, the turbulence. It started as a slight bump, nothing out of the ordinary, but then it became more violent, shaking the plane from side to side. The seatbelt sign lit up and flight attendants rushed down the aisle, securing everything as best they could. People began to murmur, some starting to panic, but Emily barely noticed. Her gaze was locked on the overhead compartment above her seat. Something had shifted in there. Something was moving inside. A shadow, a shape, moved against the hard metal, pressing and pushing from the inside of the compartment. Emily watched, frozen in horror, as the shape grew larger. It wasn't just luggage shifting. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to escape. Panic spread to the cabin, passengers screaming and shouting, their voices blending together in a cacophony of fear. The plane continued to jerk violently, as if something was trying to tear it apart. And then the compartment opened. A hand shot out from the darkness, pale and thin, with long, claw-like fingers. It gripped the edge of the overhead bin, pulling itself forward. A grotesque figure emerged, hunched and disfigured, its face a shadow of something unnatural. It was the thing from her nightmares, the one that had been haunting her through the mirrors, in the airport, in the shadows of the terminal, the one that had whispered her name. Before anyone could react, the creature leapt down the aisle, moving with terrifying speed. Its eyes locked onto Emily's, and she froze, paralyzed with fear. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was a cold whisper in her ear, "We've been waiting for you." When Emily woke, she wasn't in the plane anymore. She was lying in a hospital bed, the sterile white lights above her casting an unnatural glow. Her head ached, her limbs felt heavy, and her vision swam in and out of focus. But the one thing she couldn't deny was that the darkness, the creature, was still with her. It lingered in the corners of her mind, waiting to surface again. A nurse entered the room, her face a mask of professional calm. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. She wanted to scream, to tell someone about what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. She could still feel the creature's presence, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. "I've been waiting," the voice whispered again, but this time it came from inside her own head. Her eyes darted around the room. No one was there, but the voice, it was inescapable. "We're never leaving," it said. Emily's breath hitched as the hospital room began to fade around her, replaced by the sterile, endless hallway of an airport terminal. And at the end of the corridor, she could see the creature standing there, waiting. It was time for her to board again. The hospital room blurred into an indistinct, shifting nightmare, the walls stretching out like an endless hallway. Emily's heart raced as a familiar sensation of being trapped washed over her. The sterile white lights above flickered out one by one, replaced by dim, eerie lighting that cast long shadows across the walls. Her head spun as she tried to sit up, but her limbs were heavy, as though they no longer belonged to her. It was as if she was floating, drifting somewhere between reality and a twisted version of it. And then, in a blink, the hospital was gone. She found herself standing in the middle of a desolate airport terminal, the same one she had fled from in New Orleans. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, and the air felt thick, laden with a sense of inevitability. The terminal was empty, except for the shadows. They seemed to move, to watch, to pulse with an unnatural energy. The familiar buzzing of overhead lights filled the silence, but there was something wrong with sound. It was too sharp, too metallic, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the walls, not from the fixtures themselves. The walls of the terminal seemed to close in, the space growing smaller with each passing second, as if the building itself was alive, pressing in on her. Emily's breathing quickened. She stumbled forward, but her legs felt unsteady, her body unwilling to cooperate. Her eyes scanned the terminal, half expecting to see the man in the overcoat or the creature that had haunted her dreams. But all she could see were empty chairs, flickering monitors, and a faint outline of a figure standing near the far end of the terminal. That figure. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Her heart skipped a beat as the shape grew clearer in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, almost skeletal. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but Emily could feel its presence. It was like an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest, a force she couldn't escape. The figure didn't move at first, but its gaze, cold, unblinking, was fixed on her. And then, from the shadows, the voice came again, soft but insistent. "You've come back." Emily's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. The same one that had whispered in her ear on the plane. The same one that had spoken to her through the mirrors. It was the voice of something that had followed her. Something that had always been there, watching, waiting. Her mind raced. Was she still asleep? Was this another nightmare? No, this was real. The horrors she had experienced weren't figments of her imagination. She could still feel the tension in the air, the unnatural stillness that weighed down on her. She had escaped the airport once, but it seemed she could never truly leave. Not now. Not ever. The figure moved toward her slowly, its long, jagged steps dragging across the floor with an unsettling, hollow sound. The closer it came, the more the terminal seemed to warp and distort. The seats bent and twisted, their metal frames twisting like vines in an unnatural spiral. The walls pulsated, breathing in and out, expanding and contracting like the lungs of a beast. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice said again, and Emily felt her stomach churn. The suitcase, the warning, the man in the overcoat. It all rushed back to her in a flood of panic. Her hand instinctively reached for her pocket, the one place she had kept a crumpled note, the one warning that she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. "If you open it, you will never leave." But it was too late. She had opened it, and now she was trapped. The terminal wasn't just a building. It was a prison, a place that held the lost, the forgotten, and those foolish enough to stumble into its grasp. And it wasn't just the terminal itself. It was everywhere. It was inside her head. It had always been there, pulling the strings, manipulating everything she thought she knew. The figure was standing directly in front of her now, its eyes glowing faintly beneath the hood. Its hands, long, twisted, and clawed, reached out to touch her face. The coldness of its fingers sent a shock of ice through her body. "No, please." Emily's voice trembled, but she couldn't pull away. She couldn't move. The figure's lips, if they could even be called lips, curled into what might have been a smile too wide, too dark. "You've opened the door, Emily," it said, its voice now an overwhelming chorus of whispers. "And now you'll never leave. We are bound, you and I, bound to this place, to this time." Emily's eyes darted around, her mind trying to process what was happening. We? Who else? Was she the only one here, the only one trapped? She glanced back over her shoulder, only to see more figures emerging from shadows. Tall, thin, gaunt, shrouded in darkness, their faces obscured. They moved silently, their eyes locked onto her. The walls of the terminal groaned as if in response to her fear, the lights flickering erratically, casting flashes of light and shadow that made the figure seem to shift, to melt, to morph into something even darker. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, and Emily's chest tightened, her breath shallow. "They all come here," the voice continued, the figure's fingers brushing her skin with a touch colder than anything she had ever felt. "The ones who are lost, the ones who stumble through the cracks of reality. Once you step inside, there is no escape. You belong to us now, as they all do." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as panic overtook her. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. This was it. She wasn't just stuck in an airport. She wasn't stuck in some distorted, twisted version of reality. She was caught in a loop, a place that lived between worlds. She had opened the door, and now she would never leave. She tried to scream, to run, to fight, but the figure's hand gripped her arm, its cold fingers digging into her skin like claws. She was too weak, too tired, too broken to resist. The shadows around her grew closer, wrapping around her like a blanket of darkness, suffocating her. But then, just as she thought she might lose herself completely, there was a sound, a soft, distant rumble that seemed to come from the very heart of the terminal. Something was happening. Something was shifting. A crack, faint at first, appeared in the air in front of her. It shimmered like glass, a thin line of light breaking through the suffocating darkness. Emily's pulse quickened. Could it be? With all the strength she had left, she reached the crack, her fingers trembling as she touched the edge. The light flared brighter, blinding her for a moment, and she felt a pull, a sudden, overwhelming force that yanked her forward, dragging her out of the darkness. The terminal began to collapse around her, the walls crumbling into dust, the figures vanishing into thin air. For one brief, fleeting moment, Emily thought she might be free. Free from the endless cycle, free from the nightmare that had followed her. But then, in a final twist, she heard it again. The voice, now clearer than ever before. "You can't escape, Emily. You never will." And as the last of the terminal faded from existence, she realized that the darkness had already followed her. She was never leaving. Not truly. She was just another lost soul, bound forever to the place between worlds. And the cycle would begin again. Emily gasped for air as the world around her shifted and swirled. She was falling through a void of nothingness, unable to grasp onto anything. Her arms flailed, her heartbeat pounding in her chest. Her vision flickered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she thought she had slipped back into the nightmare. But then everything stopped. The silence was overwhelming, deafening. She stood in the middle of a vast, empty space, suspended somewhere between worlds. No sound, no light, just an eternal expanse of nothingness. Emily could feel her own presence, a sense of awareness, but it was as if everything around her had been erased, wiped away. Her legs were solid beneath her, her breathing shallow but steady. She took a step, then another, her shoes echoing the void, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The air was thick, dense with something unseen. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. But the question felt pointless, like she already knew the answer. "You're still here." The voice came again, that cold, unearthly voice that haunted her every step, following her from the airport, to the plane, to the mirror. It was everywhere inside her head, clawing at her thoughts. It spoke with a chilling certainty. "You cannot escape. Not now. Not ever." Emily's pulse quickened, the fear flooding her senses. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body felt frozen, tethered to this place in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't a place she could simply walk out of. It wasn't a place at all. It was a prison. She stumbled forward, unable to control her movements. Her legs were moving on their own, dragging her through the endless void. The voice followed, its words twisting around her thoughts. "Do you think the airport is the only place you belong? Do you think that was your final stop?" Emily's mind raced, the terror overwhelming her thoughts. Was it talking about the terminal, the twisted place that had held her captive for so long? Was she still in the same nightmare, bound by some cursed force that wouldn't let her go? Suddenly, the void began to shift, the air before her vibrating with a strange energy. She froze, her heart in her throat. The ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple, like a reflection in water. Then, out of the distortion, emerged something that made her blood run cold. A figure, a shadow. At first, it was a mere silhouette, a dark outline against the swirling void. But as it moved closer, the details began to take shape. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its features were blurred, indistinct, like a broken reflection. It was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. Not again. Emily gasped, her throat dry, her voice trembling with fear. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "You thought you were free," the voice whispered, and Emily's stomach lurched as she realized the figure wasn't just standing there. It was walking toward her, slowly, deliberately. But this is only the beginning. The figure stopped directly in front of her, and the air grew colder, sharper. Emily's breath came in short, frantic gasps as she tried to step back, but her feet were glued to the ground. She was trapped. Then the hooded figure lifted its head, and Emily saw it. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, two pools of empty, endless black. The figure didn't speak, but Emily felt its gaze like a weight pressing down on her chest. "We've been waiting, Emily." And before she could react, the figure's hands reached out, grabbing her by the arms. Its touch was freezing, like ice, sending shockwaves of cold through her body. The darkness began to close in, surrounding her, drowning her in an all-encompassing blackness. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. Her vision blurred, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. But even as the void consumed her, the last thought that crossed her mind was clear. She had never truly left the airport. It had followed her. It was part of her now, and she was never going to escape. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was back, not in the void, not in the nightmare, but somewhere familiar. She blinked, tried to adjust to the harsh light, her body aching as though she had been asleep for far too long. Slowly, she pushed herself up from the cold metal floor. Her fingers brushed against the familiar, grimy tiles beneath her. The air smelled stale, like old carpet in forgotten corners. She was in an airport terminal. Her heart skipped a beat. No, it couldn't be. Not again. She had gotten out, hadn't she? She had fought and fought to break free, to escape the endless loop. But here she was, standing in the same terminal, surrounded by the same flickering lights, the same empty chairs. A shiver ran down her spine as she looked around. The terminal was desolate, the silence suffocating, but everything felt different. It was darker, colder. The shadows were deeper, more pronounced. The space stretched on impossibly far, as if it had been abandoned for decades. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood at the far end of the terminal, obscured by shadows, just out of reach of the dim light. She could feel its gaze, as if it were watching her every move. A chill ran down her spine. "I knew you'd be back," the voice whispered, a voice she recognized all too well. It was the same voice that had haunted her nightmares, the same voice that had followed her across planes, airports, and mirrors. Emily's pulse quickened as the figure moved toward her, its limbs long and twisted, its presence consuming. It stepped out of darkness, its face finally coming into view. It was her reflection. Not exactly, but it was close enough. The figure was a twisted, dark version of herself, its eyes hollow and black. The same eyes she had seen in the mirrors. The same eyes that had haunted her from the very beginning. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt tight, like something was holding her back, suffocating her. The figure stepped closer, its mouth curling into a cruel smile. "You can never leave," it whispered, and in that moment, Emily understood. She was caught in a loop, a cycle that would never end. She had tried to escape, but there was no escape. The terminal, the mirror, the figures, they were part of her now, part of a world she could never leave. With that final thought, Emily sank to her knees, her mind spiraling into the darkness once more. And then she felt it, the familiar cold hand, gripping her arm, pulling her toward the shadows. The cycle was starting again, and she was trapped, forever. Emily's eyes fluttered open again, the weight of exhaustion and dread pressing heavily on her chest. She was still kneeling in the empty terminal, surrounded by shadows that clung to every corner. The darkness seemed to move, pulsating like a living thing, as if it had become part of the very fabric of the place. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled, weak from the unseen force that had gripped her since she first stepped into this nightmare. Her breath was shallow as she slowly raised her head, her gaze darting to the darkened corners. The voice, that same voice that had haunted her since the moment she'd first entered the airport, whispered again, "You will never escape. You are one of us now." The air grew colder, the temperature dropping at an alarming rate. Emily's hands shook as she wrapped her arms around herself for warmth, though it didn't help. It wasn't just the cold of the air. It was the chill deep within her, in her very soul. The feeling that there was no escape had become all-encompassing, smothering every ounce of hope she had left. No matter how many times she tried to fight, the cycle continued. The dark version of herself, the twisted reflection that had manifested in the shadows, stood before her, staring down at her with a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. Its hollow eyes glinted with malice, like the deep void itself. "You still think you can fight it?" The reflection hissed, its voice a distorted mockery of her own. "You cannot escape what you are, what you become." Emily's pulse hammered in her chest as her gaze flickered across the terminal. The distorted faces of countless passengers, people she'd never seen before, stood motionless, their eyes blank and empty. They were like statues, watching her unblinking. The walls seemed to close in further, the terminal expanding and contracting like the lungs of some ancient, sleeping beast. "You are trapped," the reflection continued, its grin widening, a cruel mockery of her own face. "This place, this world, this airport, it's all inside you. It's always been. You cannot run from yourself." Emily shook her head desperately, trying to block out the reflection's voice, but it was no use. The words echoed in her mind, reverberating like an unwanted melody, relentless and unyielding. She wanted to scream, to do anything to break free of the suffocating grip of the terminal, but it felt like her voice had been stolen from her, locked inside her throat. Her heart raced as she stood, forcing her legs to obey, each step slow and painful. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she had to move, had to find some way out of this place, even if she didn't know how. The terminal stretched endlessly before her, the doors just beyond reach, taunting her with the promise of escape. But she knew better than to believe that lie. The doors were just as much a prison as the walls. Then, as if on cue, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. At first, it was just a faint tap-tap-tap, barely audible. But as Emily turned her head, she saw the figure approaching once again, the tall, dark silhouette that haunted her every step. It moved with unnatural speed, its long limbs crossing the distance between them in mere moments. The air around it seemed to warp, bending with an unnatural, suffocating force. "You still don't understand, do you?" The figure's voice came again, now more powerful, more commanding. "You were never meant to leave. This is where you belong now." Emily backed away, her feet stumbling beneath her. She had to escape. There had to be something she could do to break free. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as the shadowy figure advanced. It reached out, its cold, skeletal hand moving toward her. "You can never escape what's inside you," it whispered, its voice now almost tender, as if speaking directly to her soul. "You will always return. You are the traveler. You are the lost. And the lost never find their way home." The hand brushed her arm, sending a jolt of cold terror through her body. But something inside her snapped. This couldn't be the end. She refused to believe it. She refused to surrender to this nightmare. In a burst of strength, Emily yanked her arm away, her hand flying to her pocket where she felt the crumpled paper. The note, the one that had warned her about the suitcase, the one that had hinted at the terrible truth. With shaking hands, she pulled it out and unfolded it. The words on the paper seemed to shift and writhe, as if they were alive, but Emily's eyes locked on the final line. "If you open it, you will never leave." Her breath caught in her throat. It was the same warning, the same truth she had ignored, the truth that had led her down this path. And then it hit her. The suitcase, the thing she had opened, unknowingly inviting whatever was haunting her into her world. The terminal, the endless cycle, the dark figure. She had been carrying it with her all along, not just in the literal sense, but in the very fabric of her being. She had opened it. She had released it. And now she was bound to it. The terminal wasn't just a place. It wasn't just some twisted world. It was a reflection of her, of everything she had suppressed. A place between life and death, reality and nightmares. And now she had confronted. She had to face the very thing that had kept her trapped in its grip. She looked up, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. The figure was standing before her, its skeletal hand reaching for her. But Emily didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "No," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "I am not you. I will not be you. The figure's face twisted in a snarl, its form flickering in and out of existence. But Emily didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her hand reaching into the darkness, reaching for the truth she had ignored. And as her fingers brushed against the cold, dark presence, something shifted. For a split second, everything went still. Then, with a sudden and violent shock, the entire terminal seemed to shudder, the walls cracking and groaning, as if the very foundation of the place was breaking apart. The shadows that had once clung to every corner of the room began to unravel, tearing away, like smoke dissipating in the wind. The figure screeched, its form unraveling in a burst of darkness, its shrill cry echoing throughout the collapsing terminal. Emily shielded her eyes as the air grew brighter, the cold dissipating, replaced by a warmth that spread through her chest. And then silence. When Emily opened her eyes, she was no longer in the terminal. The world around her was different, clearer. The oppressive weight that had held her in that place, that endless loop, was gone. She was standing on solid ground, the sun above her shining brightly, the scent of fresh air filling her lungs. She was free, but as she glanced around, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. A small suitcase lying in the grass nearby. A chill ran down her spine. She knew it wasn't over. The darkness had been vanquished for now, but she could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. And with a sudden realization, Emily knew the truth. The suitcase wasn't just a key to the nightmare. It was a part of her. And no matter where she went, no matter what she did, it would always follow her. The cycle was not over. It had only just begun. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was back, but not in the same place. No, this was different. The air was thick and cloying, heavy with the scent of something rotten. She could hear a faint hum, like the sound of old machinery that had been left to rust for years. The ground beneath her felt wrong. It wasn't solid. It shifted beneath her feet like the floor of an old, abandoned warehouse. The shadows, darker than any she'd seen before, stretched across the walls, reaching toward her like hungry fingers. She felt them, felt the presence of things moving in the corners, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to give in to the fear. The voices from the terminal still echoed in her mind, whispers that no longer seemed like distant thoughts, but like an invasive, living thing. You can't escape. Not now. Not ever. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her, unsteady as if they had been drained of all strength. Emily gritted her teeth, trying to focus. She had to escape. She couldn't let this be the end. She refused to become another lost soul trapped in the dark, bound to the cycle forever. Her hand instinctively reached for her pocket, where the crumpled note had once been. The paper was still there. She yanked it out, unfolding it with trembling fingers. But the words on the paper were no longer the same. The suitcase is only the beginning. You have opened the door. Now you must walk through it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the suitcase, on the object, that she hadn't fully understood what it meant. The suitcase wasn't just a physical object. It was a portal, a key to something far worse. It had always been about more than just a suitcase. It had been about the door it opened, the path that led to something far darker. A low growl rumbled through the air, and Emily's heart jumped in her chest. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room. The walls were cracked, decaying. Old, rusted beams hung from the ceiling, creaking in the unnatural stillness. Something was wrong with the room, like the very laws of reality were being bent. And then she saw them. Figures, shadows, moving, creeping from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. They were all around her, surrounding her, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The once familiar, comforting shape of the airport terminal had been replaced by this nightmare. Something deeper, something that reached into the very essence of fear. One of the figures stepped forward, its form emerging from the shadows like a ghost, its limbs long and impossibly thin. It was as if the figure had no real shape, just an outline, a dark void where its face should be. But she could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. "You can't escape us," the figure whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping together. "This is your new reality. This place is yours now." A chill ran down Emily's spine as she realized what was happening. The terminal, the airport, it was only a reflection of something far deeper. She had stepped into a place between worlds, a space that existed outside the rules of time and space. And now, it was no longer just the terminal she was running from. It was everything. She was stuck, trapped in a nightmare that would never end, bound by the same curse she had unknowingly awakened. The figures began to move closer, their forms becoming more solid, more distinct with each step. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely inhuman, either. Their bodies twisted unnaturally, their faces shifting like flickering images, constantly changing, never the same for long. The air was thick with their presence, as if the very room itself was filled with their malignant energy. Emily stumbled back, her chest tight with panic. She had to find a way out. She had to. "There is no escape," the figure repeated, its voice sinking deep into her skull. "You have entered this world, and you will never leave. Not alive." She ran. Her feet pounded the cracked floor, her breath ragged as she darted between the twisted shapes of the figures. Her mind raced, but every direction seemed wrong. The shadows clung to the walls, narrowing her path, suffocating her every move. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her in an endless cacophony of voices, drowning out everything else. She couldn't hear her own thoughts anymore. She couldn't focus. The terror that had once been manageable was now overwhelming, an all-consuming force that seemed to press on her chest, crushing the very life out of her. The room was shifting around her, its structure changing, growing, stretching, twisting into new shapes, as if it was alive. The figures were closing in. There was no escape, no hiding from them. And then, in a moment of clarity, she saw it. A door. It was far away, nestled between the crumbling beams of the room. It was made of thick, dark wood, with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. She didn't know where it had come from, or how it had appeared, but she didn't care. It was her only chance, her only way out. She ran toward it, pushing herself harder, faster. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body screaming in protest, but she couldn't stop. The figures were almost upon her, their twisted forms reaching out with long, skeletal fingers, their eyes hungry, with an unrelenting desire to claim her. With a final burst of energy, she reached the door. She yanked on the handle, the cold metal biting into her palm. It gave way with a groan, opening to reveal nothing but blackness on the other side. But the door wasn't a true escape. It was merely another threshold. As soon as she stepped through, the darkness swallowed her whole, and the world around her collapsed into nothingness. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was standing in the middle of the terminal. But it wasn't the terminal she had known. This one was different. The lights above flickered erratically, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay lingered. It was silent, too silent. Her heart pounded as she looked around, but there was no one. No people waiting for flights, no distant announcements crackling through the speakers. Just empty seats, empty halls, and the distant hum of malfunctioning lights. The suitcase was beside her, the black void inside it swirling as if it were calling her. Emily's eyes locked onto it, and in that moment she understood. This wasn't the end. She hadn't escaped. The darkness was still here. It had followed her into this new place, this new terminal, and it would follow her again no matter how many doors she opened, no matter how many cycles she tried to break. The terminal was a reflection of her, of the fear that had taken root in her soul. She could feel it then. The whispers. "You are still ours." The cycle had not ended. It would never end. And Emily finally understood that there was no escape from this nightmare. Emily's chest tightened as she stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, staring at the suitcase. The darkness inside it had shifted once again, writhing like an alive, breathing entity, pulsing with strange, hypnotic rhythm. She felt as though the very air around her had thickened, pressing against her body, suffocating her. The terminal that surrounded her had grown colder, and the silence seemed to swallow every sound. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, louder with each passing second. She tried to turn away, to break free from the grip of the suitcase, but it was as if the shadows themselves were reaching out for her. The weight of their presence pressed against her skin, dragging her in. Every instinct in her screamed for her to run, to escape, but she knew, deep down, that running would be useless. It always had been. You are one of us. The voice was a whisper at first, but it soon enveloped her, vibrating through her very bones. It was familiar now, comforting in its cruelty. She had heard it so many times, each time growing louder, more insistent, until it became a part of her thoughts, a part of her being. The more she tried to escape it, the more it latched on. No, I'm not, Emily whispered to herself, shaking her head. She clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. I won't be one of you. The suitcase, almost as if it had heard her defiance, groaned and creaked open on its own, the air around it swirling. The shadows inside seemed to thicken, congealing into dark tendrils that snaked toward her like fingers, seeking to drag her into the abyss. Emily took a step back, but the floor beneath her shifted, buckling and distorting. The entire terminal seemed to warp in response to the opening of the suitcase, twisting like a funhouse mirror. The walls stretched and bent in unnatural angles, and the ceiling seemed to sink, lowering in slow, menacing increments. The light flickered and buzzed, casting eerie, stuttering glows on the now twisted, distorted faces of the passengers frozen in place. The once familiar sounds of the airport, announcements, the shuffle of feet, the distant hum of air conditioners, were gone. Instead, a low, persistent growl reverberated through the room, like a deep, hidden heartbeat beneath the floor. The air was thick with something foul, like decay. The terminal had transformed into a macabre reflection of its former self, a place where the boundaries of reality had blurred. You cannot leave. The voice came again, this time in the form of a low growl. It was no longer a whisper. It was loud, mocking. This place is your prison. You will never escape the darkness you've unleashed. Emily's mind reeled, her thoughts scattered like pieces of glass. She was slipping, falling further into this nightmare. But something deep inside her, something she had buried under layers of fear and uncertainty, stirred. The suitcase was the key, the portal, but it wasn't just a physical object. It was a symbol of her fear, her guilt, her unresolved pain. The darkness she had seen was not just some external force. It was inside her, too. Every time she tried to close the door, the darkness found its way back in, creeping through the cracks she refused to face. Suddenly, the shadows around her began to move faster, more aggressively. The shapes of passengers, once motionless, began to twitch, their bodies jerking unnaturally as if they were being puppeteered by invisible strings. Their eyes were wide open, their pupils black and lifeless. They weren't just people, they were shells, empty vessels, waiting to be filled with the same void that had consumed Emily. You brought this upon yourself, Emily, a voice crooned, and she recognized it instantly. It was her own voice, but distorted, warped. You thought you could outrun it. You thought you could escape your own shadow. The dark reflection of herself stepped forward from the crowd of hollow-eyed passengers, a twisted version of who she was, a dark, corrupted doppelganger. Its eyes were hollow, its smile a grotesque caricature of her own. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, veins pulsing with black, dark energy. The figure spoke again, but this time its words were not just mocking. They were bitter. This is your punishment, Emily. You cannot outrun what is inside you. You are as much a part of this nightmare as it is a part of you. The doppelganger's fingers twitched, and the shadows around her thickened, moving toward her like a flood, blocking every escape. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she was pulled into the embrace of the darkness. She struggled, gasping for air as the shadows wrapped themselves around her limbs, squeezing tighter with every second. You cannot escape. You are forever bound to the terminal, to the darkness, to the endless cycle. You are the traveler, the lost, and the lost never find their way home. The words echoed through her mind, drowning out her thoughts, and suddenly, everything clicked into place. This was her fate. She couldn't escape. The terminal was never just a place. It was a reflection of her own mind, her own fears, her own endless guilt. She had carried this darkness with her for so long, running from it, but never confronting it. And now it had consumed everything. The suitcase was never meant to be closed. It was meant to be understood. It was a part of her, a manifestation of everything she had tried to hide, everything she had tried to outrun. She was the cause of her own imprisonment. With a sob, Emily stopped struggling, letting the darkness take her. She closed her eyes, accepting it, feeling the cold tendrils of the shadows curl around her heart. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she stopped fighting. The world around her darkened further, until it was pitch black. There was no light, no sound, no air, just silence and the cold touch of the abyss. When Emily opened her eyes again, she found herself standing at the entrance to the terminal. But it wasn't like it had been before. The walls were cracked and decaying, the lights flickering like dying stars. The air felt heavier, more suffocating than it ever had before. The familiar hum of the airport was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her skin. She glanced down at her hands, and for a moment she thought she saw something move beneath her skin, a dark, creeping shadow curling through her veins. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the truth. She was no longer just a visitor in this place. She was part of it now. The suitcase lay before her, the same as it always had been, its dark void beckoning. Emily knew deep down that this was the beginning of the end. She couldn't run anymore. There was no escaping the terminal. There was no escaping what she had become. And as the darkness surrounded her once more, she knew the truth. This place wasn't just a nightmare. It was her prison, and she would never leave. Emily's vision blurred as she stood frozen in the decaying terminal. She could feel the weight of it, the crushing, suffocating weight of inevitability. The terminal wasn't just a place anymore. It was a prison. Her prison. A manifestation of her soul's torment, of the things she couldn't outrun, the things she had tried to forget. The suitcase lay at her feet, the darkness inside still swirling, pulling her in. The hum of the forgotten lights above her was all she could hear. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of rot, of time left untouched. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, but no matter how she tried, she couldn't move. The shadows, now alive with malevolent force, crept toward her, dragging their tendrils along the walls, as if to wrap her in their cold embrace. She had accepted it, hadn't she? She had stopped fighting the inevitable. The darkness, the void, it was no longer just an external force. It was a part of her, something that had always been inside her, waiting for her to stop running, to stop resisting. Emily's gaze fell to the suitcase once more. She had seen it in the reflection. It was never about the suitcase itself. It was a symbol, a reflection of what she had carried inside her all these years. The fear, the shame, the guilt, the unfinished business that haunted her every waking moment. It had followed her through every step, every attempt to escape, to outrun it. Now, she was back where it had all started. The suitcase opened of its own accord, the shadows inside growing thicker, more defined. It beckoned her, called her in, as though it was offering her something. Or perhaps offering her nothing at all. There was no promise of escape, no freedom. Only more of the same endless loop. You thought you could escape, the voice murmured, the same distorted, twisted voice that had haunted her for so long. But there is no escaping yourself, Emily. There is no leaving this place. You belong to it now. You are as much a part of it as the walls, the shadows, the darkness. You are lost, forever. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady herself. The voice echoed in her mind, but she didn't resist. She couldn't. She had already accepted it, hadn't she? But just as the shadows were about to close in, she felt it, a flicker, a spark of something, deep within her. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A memory, a feeling of defiance. She had been running for so long, trying to escape this nightmare. She had tried to fight it, to push it away, but it was never about running. It was about facing it, confronting it, accepting what had happened, what she had become, the terminal, the suitcase, the darkness. It wasn't just a manifestation of her guilt or fear. It was a reflection of her struggle, the fight between running and accepting the inevitable. But Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. With her hands trembling, Emily reached for the suitcase again. The darkness seemed to pulse, but this time it was different. It wasn't pulling her in with the same hunger, the same relentless force. It was waiting, watching. She reached inside, feeling the cold emptiness. Her fingers brushed against something, the edge of something hard, something familiar. A key. She pulled it out, and the instant it touched her skin, the darkness recoiled. The shadows screeched, retreating as though the key itself was burning them away. The terminal seemed to tremble around her, the walls shaking with a violent force. The suitcase snapped shut, and the room was flooded with light. Bright, blinding light that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the nightmare. The whispers faded, the cold shadows pulling back into nothingness. The oppressive air lightened, and the once decayed terminal slowly began to change. The walls returned to their original, sterile state. The broken lights flickered back to life. The stale, stagnant air shifted into something more natural, more real. Emily blinked, confused. Was this it? Had she done it? Was this the end? She looked down at the key in her hand. It was small, ornate, but old, covered in markings she didn't understand. But it felt right. It felt final. And just as she was about to turn and leave, a figure appeared in front of her. It was tall, thin, and its face was hidden in shadow. But this time, Emily didn't flinch. She didn't step back. You think this is over? The figure's voice echoed through the terminal, deep and resonating. You think you have won? You cannot defeat the darkness. You cannot defeat yourself. You are still trapped, and you always will be. Emily tightened her grip on the key. She wasn't going to let it control her anymore. This time, she wasn't running. She wasn't backing down. She raised the key, and as her fingers curled around it, the terminal around her seemed to shift. The air thickened and the walls twisted again, but this time, it was different. This time, the terminal wasn't closing in on her. It was opening up. A door appeared before her, a doorway that seemed to lead into the unknown. The figure in front of her reached out, but this time, Emily was ready. With a deep breath, she stepped toward the door. The figure screamed, its form dissipating as the door opened wide. The terminal faded, the once dark and decaying place transforming into something brighter, more hopeful. The shadows retreated, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily saw a world beyond the terminal, a new beginning. As she stepped through the door, the key in her hand pulsed with a warm light. It was no longer a symbol of fear, but a symbol of her triumph. She had faced the darkness, and in doing so, had set herself free. The terminal was behind her now. The cycle was over. Emily had finally escaped. The end.